Welcome to Nightmare House of Horror. In the space between sleeping and waking, between the familiar and the strange, between what we think we know and what actually is, that's where tonight's story lives. I've built my career exploring these liminal spaces, these cracks in reality where the most profound terrors take root and flourish. What you're about to hear isn't a story about monsters that announce themselves with roars and claws. This is about the kind of horror that whispers, that suggests, that makes you question whether that shadow in your peripheral vision moved on its own, whether that conversation you overheard was actually meant for your ears, whether the person staring back at you from photographs is really the same person you see in the mirror. Tonight, we enter the world of Daniel Morrison, who discovered that the most terrifying revelations don't come with dramatic fanfare. They arrive quietly, like noticing your reflection blinks a half second after you do. This is the story of a mind that began remembering its own memories, creating infinite loops of recollection that distorted reality until past and present became indistinguishable echoes in an endless chamber of consciousness. Part 1. The Routine Fractures. It was 11 minutes past 3 in the morning on the 17th of September when Daniel Morrison first noticed he was remembering a memory he'd already remembered. The realization struck him as he lay in bed, staring at the water stain on his ceiling that looked like a map of somewhere he'd never been but somehow recognized. He'd been thinking about his conversation with Sarah earlier that day, except he remembered thinking about that conversation yesterday, and the day before, and the thought of thinking about it made his skull feel too small for his brain. The bedroom felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, as if the familiar dimensions had shifted by degrees too small to measure, but large enough to create unease. The digital clock cast its green glow across surfaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and Daniel found himself counting his heartbeats. 67, 68, 69. When had he started counting? He remembered starting to count. Remembered the decision to count. Remembered remembering that decision. Sarah had said something about recursive loops during their coffee meeting at Meridian Cafe. Something about how computer programs could get trapped calling themselves infinitely. He'd laughed at the time, made some joke about his own programming classes in college. But now, lying in the suffocating darkness of 3:14 in the morning, he wondered if human consciousness could experience the same malfunction. The water stain pulsed slightly with each blink, or perhaps his vision was creating the movement. He'd noticed that stain for the first time 6 months ago when he'd moved into this apartment. Or had it been longer? The memory felt layered, like looking through multiple exposures of the same photograph. He remembered discovering the stain, remembered being annoyed by it, remembered planning to fix it, remembered forgetting to fix it, remembered remembering he'd forgotten to fix it. Daniel sat up, disturbing the precise arrangement of sheets and blankets he'd created through 53 nights of careful sleep positioning. The movement felt familiar in a way that suggested repetition, muscle memory executing an action he'd performed before in circumstances exactly like these. But when? His apartment smelled of old coffee and the lingering chemical tang of cleaning products, scents that belonged to Tuesday, except wasn't it Thursday? The days had been blending together since he'd started working from home, since the promotion that had seemed like such good news but now felt like acceptance into some exclusive club he'd never wanted to join. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, feet finding the cold hardwood floor that creaked in 3 specific places between his bed and the bathroom. Creak 1 came under his left foot at the 2-step mark. Creak 2 under his right foot at step 4. Creak 3 when his weight shifted fully onto his left foot at step 6. He knew this pattern because he'd cataloged it, because his mind seemed compelled to document details with the precision of someone expecting to be questioned about them later. The bathroom mirror reflected a face that looked like him but tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Dark circles under brown eyes that seemed to be looking at something just to the left of their own reflection. Hair standing at angles that defied his usual morning routine, though morning was still 3 hours away. When had he last slept through the night? The memory reached back through a series of interrupted sleeps, each night blending into the previous, until he couldn't locate the last time he'd woken naturally, instead of jolting awake with the sensation of falling through his own thoughts. Daniel splashed cold water on his face, watching the drops hit the porcelain basin with tiny impacts that sounded like distant rain. The water felt real enough, cold enough to shock his nervous system into the present moment. But even this present felt recursive. as if he were experiencing a memory of washing his face while simultaneously creating the memory that would echo back to him tomorrow, next week, next month. He returned to bed at 3:27 in the morning, pulling the covers up to his chin and staring at the water stain that definitely looked like a map now. A map of territories that existed only in the geography of disturbed sleep, somewhere between the familiar creaks of the floorboard and the unfamiliar sensation of being awake when the world expected him to be dreaming. Daniel Morrison began to suspect that his mind was developing an appetite for its own content, feeding on memories until they became distorted through infinite digestion and regurgitation. Part 2. Professional competence. At 34 years of age, Daniel Morrison had built a career on the reliable functioning of human memory. His work as a data analyst for Meridian Insurance required him to identify patterns in vast databases, to remember which claims correlated with which circumstances, to maintain mental maps of statistical relationships that less disciplined minds couldn't navigate. He prided himself on his ability to recall case numbers, policy details, and actuarial tables with the precision of a machine programmed for perfect retention. His home office occupied the northeast corner of his apartment, positioned to catch the morning light that would stream through tall windows overlooking the intersection of 5th Street and Meridian Avenue. The space reflected his methodical nature. 2 monitors arranged at precisely the same height, a keyboard worn smooth in specific patterns by his fingertips, a coffee mug that held exactly 12 ounces when filled to the level that prevented spilling during his morning routine. Daniel had established patterns over the 18 months since accepting the promotion to senior analyst. Coffee first, prepared with 4 level tablespoons of ground beans and filtered water heated to exactly 195 degrees Fahrenheit. Email review second, addressing messages in order of timestamp rather than importance, because chronology created a logical framework that his mind could follow without effort. Data analysis third, diving into the numerical relationships that revealed themselves to minds trained to recognize them. This particular Thursday morning, he was certain it was Thursday because his calendar application displayed the day clearly in the bottom right corner of his primary monitor. Began with the same routine that had proven effective for 547 consecutive workdays. Coffee achieved perfect temperature at 8:33 in the morning. Emails totaled 17, none requiring immediate response. The Hendricks case files loaded without the usual lag that suggested his computer's memory was becoming inadequate for the volume of data he processed daily. But something felt recursive about the morning's work, as if he were processing information he'd already analyzed. The Hendricks claim involved water damage at a residential property in the Riverside district, caused by a pipe failure that occurred on the 9th of August at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon. Standard processing required verification of the homeowner's policy coverage, assessment of claimed damages against submitted photographs, and cross-reference with similar claims to identify potential fraud indicators. Daniel remembered reviewing these exact documents before. Not similar documents, these specific photographs of water-stained drywall and warped hardwood flooring, this particular estimate from Morrison Restoration Services, this identical series of correspondence between the homeowner and the initial claims adjuster. But according to his system logs, this was his first time accessing the Hendricks file. The computer's memory disagreed with his own, creating a discrepancy that gnawed at his professional confidence. He opened a new document to record his analysis, fingers finding their familiar positions on the keyboard that had adapted to his typing patterns over years of shared use. The words appeared on screen with the mechanical rhythm he'd perfected. Initial review suggests legitimate claim consistent with reported pipe failure. Damage estimates align with standard cost projections for water restoration in residential properties of comparable square footage and construction materials. Except he remembered typing those exact words before. Remembered the slight resistance of the period key that required extra pressure to register properly. Remembered the moment of satisfaction when he'd completed the sentence with precise professional language. The memory felt current rather than historical, as if it were happening simultaneously with the present moment rather than preceding it. Daniel saved the document and closed the Hendricks file, but the sensation of repetition persisted. His coffee had cooled to the temperature where it became bitter rather than smooth, a transition that occurred predictably after 23 minutes of sitting in his ceramic mug. He'd learned this timing through careful observation, The same attention to detail that made him effective at identifying patterns in insurance data that revealed themselves only to minds disciplined enough to notice subtle correlations. The morning proceeded through its established sequence. 3 more files analyzed, 2 phone calls with field adjusters confirming details about property damage assessments, 1 brief conversation with Sarah from the Fraud Investigation Department about suspicious patterns in commercial fire claims. Each interaction felt familiar beyond the usual comfort of routine work, familiar in the specific way that suggested exact repetition rather than general similarity. By 11:45 in the morning, Daniel had completed his scheduled analysis tasks and updated his daily productivity log with numbers that reflected consistent performance standards. His supervisor, Mr. Roberts, would review these metrics during their weekly meeting and find them satisfactory. The predictability of this approval process usually provided Daniel with professional satisfaction, but today it felt hollow, as if he were performing actions whose outcomes he already knew because he'd experienced them before. He leaned back in his ergonomic chair, studying the familiar arrangement of his office space, the coffee mug with its ring stains marking previous day's work, the stack of printed reports arranged in perfect alignment with the edge of his desk, the photograph of his sister Jennifer, taken during their vacation to Lake Superior 3 summers ago. Everything occupied its proper position. Everything reflected the organized mind of someone who understood that external order supported internal clarity. But the clarity felt compromised, contaminated by the persistent sensation that his current experience was an echo of previous experience, that his professional competence was becoming trapped in recursive loops that threatened the very reliability on which his career was built. Part 3. The second glance confirms. 3 days later, sometime between 9:30 and 10 in the evening on what his calendar insisted was Sunday the 20th of September, Daniel discovered that the recursive sensation had evolved beyond occasional déjà vu into something that defied rational categorization. He sat at his kitchen table, grading papers for the night school statistics course he taught twice weekly at the community college. When he realized he was remembering grading these exact papers before, not similar papers from previous semesters, but these specific essays with their characteristic handwriting patterns, their individual approaches to statistical analysis problems, their particular mistakes and insights. The memory felt layered, like examining multiple transparent sheets stacked upon each other. He remembered the first time he'd read Jennifer Walsh's essay about correlation versus causation, remembered being impressed by her clear understanding of the concepts, remembered writing encouraging comments in the margins. But he also remembering that first reading, remembered the moment of recollection during what he now thought of as the second reading, though the papers had arrived in his faculty mailbox only this afternoon. Daniel set down his red pen and studied the kitchen that had become his evening office, the space where he'd established a routine of alternating between insurance work and academic responsibilities. The overhead light cast shadows that fell at angles he'd never noticed before, creating geometric patterns on the linoleum that suggested mathematical relationships his conscious mind couldn't quite grasp. The refrigerator hummed with electrical consistency, a sound that had become background noise over his 18 months of residence but now felt intrusive, as if it were announcing something significant that his rational mind refused to acknowledge. The stack of papers represented 23 students enrolled in Statistics 101. Each essay responding to the same prompt about identifying statistical fallacies in newspaper reporting. Daniel had designed this assignment to help students recognize how data could be manipulated to support predetermined conclusions, a skill that served them whether they continued in mathematics or applied critical thinking to their daily lives as informed citizens. But as he continued grading, the recursive sensation intensified. Timothy Chen's essay about correlation and ice cream sales contained the same grammatical error in the 3rd paragraph, the same insight about temperature as a confounding variable, the same request for clarification about confidence intervals that Daniel remembered from the previous reading, except there had been no previous reading. According to his gradebook, he distributed this assignment on Wednesday and collected it Friday, following his standard 5-day turnaround policy. Daniel opened his laptop and navigated to the course management system where he recorded assignment details and submission dates. The digital timestamps confirmed his memory of the assignment schedule, but they also revealed something that made his stomach contract with unexplained anxiety. His own comments on the student papers were already recorded in the system, completed grades already submitted to the registrar's office, detailed feedback already sent to student email accounts. According to the computer's memory, he'd finished grading these papers on Saturday, the 19th of September at 11:57 in the evening. But according to his own memory, he was grading them for the first time on Sunday the 20th at 9:43 in the evening. The discrepancy created a gap in his understanding of linear time that felt dangerous in ways he couldn't articulate. Daniel refreshed the web page, wondering if the system had registered some kind of data error. The information remained consistent: grades submitted, feedback provided, assignment completed. But the papers sat before him on his kitchen table, ungraded, red pen marks absent from their margins, his handwriting nowhere to be seen on pages that the computer insisted he'd already evaluated and returned to students. He picked up Timothy Chen's essay again, reading the opening paragraph about statistical manipulation in pharmaceutical marketing. The words felt familiar in the specific way that suggested he'd not only read them before but had responded to them, had written encouraging comments about the students' critical thinking skills, had marked minor grammatical errors for correction in future assignments. The memory of grading was precise enough to include the moment when he'd paused to consider whether Timothy's insight deserved an A- or a full A. The brief internal debate resolved in favor of the higher grade because the analysis demonstrated genuine statistical literacy. But the paper remained unmarked, pristine except for the student's original handwriting. No red ink, no marginal comments, no grade recorded in the upper right corner where Daniel always placed his evaluations. The physical evidence contradicted both his memory and the computer's records, creating a three-way disagreement about the nature of recent events that challenged his understanding of reliable documentation. Daniel stood and walked to his refrigerator, opening the door to retrieve a bottle of water that would clear his mind and restore his ability to think rationally about the situation. The cold air carried the scent of leftover Chinese takeout from Friday's dinner, a smell that triggered another recursive memory. He remembered opening this refrigerator door before, remembered reaching for this same bottle of water, remembered the moment of confusion when he discovered that his grading was simultaneously completed and unfinished. The sensation felt like standing between two mirrors, watching his reflection repeat infinitely in both directions. Each iteration slightly distorted until the final images bore only approximate resemblance to the original. Except instead of visual reflections, his mind was creating temporal echoes, memories of memories that doubled back on themselves until past and present became indistinguishable. He returned to the kitchen table where 23 papers waited for evaluation that had already been completed, where red ink comments existed in his memory but not on paper, where his professional competence was trapped in recursive loops that suggested his mind was developing an appetite for its own content, consuming memories until they became distorted through infinite digestion and regurgitation. Part 4. Evidence accumulates. After 6 sleepless nights of checking and rechecking his memory against physical evidence, Daniel Morrison began to document the recursive episodes with a systematic precision that had made him successful in data analysis. He purchased a composition notebook with ruled pages and began recording each instance where his memory of events contradicted external documentation, where he remembered remembering things that hadn't yet happened, where the present moment felt like an echo of experiences that existed only in his recall. The documentation revealed patterns that disturbed him more than the individual incidents. Episodes occurred most frequently during routine activities: grading papers, reviewing insurance files, preparing coffee, checking email. The recursive memories attached themselves to mundane actions rather than dramatic events, suggesting that his mind's malfunction targeted the very foundation of daily existence rather than exceptional circumstances. Tuesday, the 22nd of September, produced 7 documented episodes between 6:15 in the morning and 11:30 in the evening. Episode 1 occurred during his morning coffee preparation. When he remembered the precise moment the coffee maker would finish brewing, not anticipated it based on familiar timing, but remembered experiencing the completion of the brewing cycle as if it had already happened. Episode 2 manifested during his shower, when he found himself recalling the sensation of washing his hair while simultaneously performing the action for what his rational mind insisted was the first time that morning. By episode 4, which involved remembering a phone conversation with his supervisor, Mr. Roberts, while the conversation was still in progress, Daniel began to suspect that his consciousness was developing temporal displacement, experiencing events in non-linear sequence that created the illusion of repetition, when past and present collapsed into simultaneous experience. The composition notebook became a lifeline to objective reality, a record that existed outside his increasingly unreliable memory. He wrote in blue ink during morning episodes, black ink during afternoon occurrences, and red ink for evening manifestations, creating a color-coded system that would help him identify patterns in the timing and frequency of recursive experiences. The physical act of writing provided anchor points to linear time, moments when pen met paper in sequential order that followed logical causation rather than the circular loops his memory seemed to prefer. Thursday, the 24th, brought a new development that transformed his documentation from academic exercise to desperate necessity. While reviewing the Hartwell insurance claim, a kitchen fire that occurred on the 15th of September in a duplex on Riverside Drive, Daniel discovered that he'd already completed his analysis 3 times. Not similar analyses of comparable claims, but identical reviews of the same photographs, the same damage estimates, the same correspondence with the policyholder. According to his computer files, he'd submitted his initial report on September 18th. According to his handwritten notes, he'd reviewed the case again on September 21st, reaching identical conclusions through apparently identical analytical processes. According to his memory, he was examining the Hartwell file for the first time on September 24th, while simultaneously remembering both previous reviews with perfect clarity. The recursion had evolved beyond simple déjà vu into temporal fragmentation that threatened his ability to distinguish between linear experience and circular memory. Each review of the Hartwell case felt authentic, complete with the appropriate professional satisfaction when he'd identified the cause of the fire as accidental rather than fraudulent. But authentic experience repeated exactly 3 times suggested either supernatural intervention in his consciousness or psychological breakdown that required immediate professional intervention. Daniel called his physician, Dr. Margaret Stevenson, and scheduled an appointment for comprehensive neurological evaluation. During the phone conversation, he experienced the now familiar sensation of remembering making this call while simultaneously making it, remembering Dr. Stevenson's concerned questions about his symptoms while answering those questions for what his rational mind insisted was the first time. The recursive loop felt so complete that he could predict her responses with perfect accuracy, not through logical anticipation but through precise recall of a conversation that was happening as he remembered it. Dr. Stevenson scheduled him for magnetic resonance imaging, electroencephalography, and comprehensive blood work to rule out neurological conditions that could affect memory and temporal perception. The appointment was set for Monday, the 28th of September at 10:15 in the morning, giving him 4 days to continue documenting episodes that had begun to feel less like symptoms and more like windows into the actual structure of consciousness that most people never recognized. Friday evening brought the most disturbing episode yet documented. While preparing dinner pasta with marinara sauce, his standard end-of-week meal, Daniel realized he was simultaneously remembering eating this dinner, cooking this dinner, and shopping for the ingredients earlier that afternoon. The 3 temporal states existed concurrently in his consciousness, creating a layered experience where cause and effect became meaningless because all stages of the process were present simultaneously. He stood in his kitchen, wooden spoon in hand, watching pasta water that hadn't yet begun to boil, while remembering the satisfaction of the completed meal, the slight disappointment that the sauce had been too salty, the mental note to purchase better quality tomatoes next time he shopped for ingredients. The memories felt as current and immediate as the actual cooking process, creating a temporal overlap that suggested his mind had lost the ability to sequence events in linear order. The composition notebook recorded this episode in red ink across 3 pages of increasingly frantic handwriting. Daniel found himself writing faster as the recursive sensation intensified, documenting an experience that felt like watching his consciousness fragment into temporal shards that reflected distorted images of the same moment from multiple angles. By the time he'd completed his notes, the pasta water was boiling exactly as he'd remembered it would. The timer indicating 12 minutes and 37 seconds had elapsed exactly as his memory had predicted, the entire sequence unfolding with the precision of events that had already been determined rather than events being experienced for the first time. Saturday brought no episodes, a break in the pattern that felt more ominous than relief. Daniel spent the day reading about temporal lobe epilepsy, dissociative disorders, and rare neurological conditions that could affect memory processing. The medical literature described symptoms that resembled his experiences but failed to capture the specific quality of recursive consciousness that felt less like illness and more like awakening to the actual nature of time and memory that normal awareness filtered out for the sake of functional existence. Sunday, the 27th, produced 12 episodes, more than any previous day, suggesting that whatever was happening to his consciousness was accelerating towards some kind of culmination that might resolve the temporal fragmentation or destroy his ability to function in linear reality. The documentation in his composition notebook had expanded to 43 pages of detailed observations, creating a record that would either help medical professionals understand his condition or serve as evidence of a mind's systematic dissolution into recursive madness. Part 5. Recording unreliable witnesses. At 20 minutes before midnight on the 28th of September, Daniel sat in the waiting room of Meridian Medical Center's neurology department, clutching his composition notebook while experiencing the recursive memory of sitting in this exact chair, clutching this exact notebook, waiting for the same appointment he was about to attend. The sensation had become so familiar that he developed a classification system. Type 1 recursion involved remembering future events while experiencing them. Type 2 involved remembering past events that contradicted external documentation. And Type 3, the newest and most disturbing category, involved remembering memories that belonged to other versions of himself existing in parallel temporal streams. Dr. Margaret Stevenson emerged from her office at exactly the time Daniel remembered she would, wearing the same navy blazer and concerned expression he'd already experienced during this appointment that hadn't yet occurred. She was a woman in her early 50s whose confidence suggested decades of experience with neurological anomalies. But Daniel could already recall the moment later in the examination when that confidence would falter as his symptoms defied standard diagnostic categories. "Mr. Morrison," she said, extending her hand in greeting. "Thank you for coming in. I understand you've been experiencing some unusual memory symptoms." Daniel shook her hand while simultaneously remembering the texture of her grip, the slight coolness of her palm, the professional warmth of her greeting that would give way to clinical puzzlement as his case proved resistant to medical explanation. The handshake felt both immediate and historical, present and past, creating temporal overlap that made simple human interaction feel like performance art based on precise script memorization. "I've been documenting the episodes," he replied, holding up the composition notebook that had become his anchor to external reality. 47 pages of observations, covering 12 days of systematic memory dysfunction. Dr. Stevenson led him into her office, a space designed to suggest both medical authority and patient comfort. Diplomas hung in precise arrangements on walls painted calming beige, while her desk displayed the organized efficiency of someone who processed complex neurological information daily. Daniel had already experienced this environment, had already answered the questions she was about to ask, had already undergone the examination that would reveal nothing abnormal about his brain function. "Can you describe the nature of these memory episodes?" Dr. Stevenson asked, settling into her chair with the practiced movement of medical professionals who spent their days managing information about human consciousness in various states of breakdown. Daniel opened his composition notebook to the summary page he'd prepared for this appointment, the page he remembered writing while experiencing the memory of reading it aloud to Dr. Stevenson during a consultation that existed simultaneously in future, present, and past. "I've identified 3 distinct types of temporal displacement. Type 1 involves remembering events while they're happening, as if I've experienced them before. Type 2 involves remembering events that contradict physical evidence about when they occurred. Type 3 involves remembering events that seem to belong to other versions of myself." Dr. Stevenson made notes on her tablet while asking questions that Daniel answered with increasing specificity, describing symptoms that had no established medical terminology. She inquired about head trauma, medication changes, stress levels, sleep patterns, and family history of neurological disorders. Each question felt familiar because he'd already answered it, yet authentic because he was answering it for the first time, creating conversational loops that demonstrated the exact problem he was trying to explain. The physical examination revealed normal reflexes, normal cognitive responses to standard tests, and normal ability to recall recent events in linear sequence when prompted by external cues. Dr. Stevenson tested his memory using word lists, image recognition tasks, and temporal sequencing exercises that he passed without difficulty, creating the paradox of normal memory function during medical evaluation, alongside persistent temporal fragmentation during normal daily experience. "Your neurological responses appear completely normal," Dr. Stevenson said, completing her examination with the professional puzzlement Daniel had already remembered experiencing from her perspective. "However, your descriptions suggest genuine perceptual anomalies that deserve investigation through imaging and electroencephalographic analysis." The magnetic resonance imaging appointment was scheduled for Wednesday, the 1st of October at 2:30 in the afternoon, followed by electroencephalography on Friday the 3rd at 11:15 in the morning. Daniel accepted these appointments while remembering their outcomes. The imaging would reveal normal brain structure with no signs of trauma, inflammation, or anomalous development, while the electroencephalography would show normal electrical activity with occasional theta wave patterns that suggested deep, meditative states rather than pathological dysfunction. "In the meantime," Dr. Stevenson continued, "I'd like you to continue documenting these episodes with particular attention to triggers, duration, and any environmental factors that might correlate with their occurrence. The level of detail in your current documentation is exceptional. Most patients struggle to articulate these kinds of perceptual anomalies with such precision." Daniel thanked her for the appointment, while simultaneously thanking her the moment when he would later realize that his exceptional documentation wasn't a sign of analytical competence, but evidence that he'd been experiencing recursive consciousness long enough to develop systematic approaches to managing temporal fragmentation. The realization existed in his memory as clearly as if it had already occurred, yet felt shocking as if he were thinking it for the first time. The drive home from the medical center occurred along familiar streets that felt foreign because he was remembering driving them in the opposite direction during a future appointment, remembering conversations with Dr. Stevenson that hadn't yet happened, but felt as authentic as the consultation he'd just completed. Traffic lights changed according to patterns he recalled from previous trips along this route, creating the illusion that he was traveling through time as much as space, moving through a city where cause and effect had become negotiable. Back in his apartment, Daniel added 7 pages of new documentation to his composition notebook, recording not only the medical appointment, but the recursive memories that had accompanied each moment of the examination. The writing process itself had become recursive. With his hand following patterns, he remembered tracing while simultaneously tracing them for the first time, creating loops within loops that suggested his documentation was becoming part of the phenomenon it was attempting to record. Wednesday arrived with the magnetic resonance imaging appointment that Daniel experienced as a memory while it was happening. Lying in the machine's cylindrical chamber, while remembering the claustrophobic sensation, the rhythmic noise of magnetic fields mapping his brain tissue, the technician's reassuring voice explaining each stage of the procedure. The results would be normal, he already knew, just as he already knew that normal results would provide no explanation for consciousness that had begun feeding on its own content until memories became indistinguishable from immediate experience. Friday's electroencephalography confirmed his memory of its outcome. Normal electrical activity with theta wave patterns that suggested altered states of consciousness, consistent with deep meditation or certain types of temporal lobe activity. The technician mentioned that his brain waves resembled those found in experienced practitioners of mindfulness meditation, people who had trained their consciousness to exist more fully in present moments by becoming hyper-aware of mental processes that usually operated below conscious attention. Some people naturally develop heightened awareness of their own thinking patterns, the technician explained. It's not pathological, but it can create unusual subjective experiences as consciousness becomes more sensitive to its own operations. Daniel left the medical center with normal test results and an explanation that felt both accurate and inadequate. His brain functioned normally, but his consciousness had become hyper-aware of its own temporal processing, creating recursive loops that most people never noticed because their attention remained focused outward rather than inward. The medical evaluation had confirmed his physical health while validating the authenticity of experiences that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of memory, time, and self-awareness. Part 6. Medical explanations dissolve. 8 grueling weeks of medical testing revealed only that Daniel Morrison's brain functioned within normal parameters, while his consciousness operated according to principles that medical science couldn't adequately explain. Dr. Stevenson's comprehensive evaluation had ruled out neurological disorders, psychiatric conditions, and metabolic irregularities that could affect memory processing, leaving him with clean medical records and symptoms that persisted despite their apparent impossibility. The test results created a catalog of normal function. Magnetic resonance imaging showed healthy brain tissue with no signs of trauma, inflammation, or structural anomalies that could explain temporal displacement experiences. Electroencephalographic monitoring revealed normal electrical activity, with occasional theta wave patterns consistent with heightened awareness rather than pathological dysfunction. Blood work indicated optimal nutrition, hormone levels, and neurochemical balance that suggested physical health, incompatible with the psychological symptoms he documented across 93 pages of detailed observations. Daniel sat in Dr. Stevenson's office on the 15th of November, reviewing results that contradicted his lived experience, while simultaneously remembering this consultation from the perspective of someone who had already attended it multiple times. The recursive sensation had evolved beyond simple déjà vu into temporal overlap so complete that he existed simultaneously in past, present, and future versions of this appointment, experiencing all temporal states as equally immediate and authentic. Medically speaking, you're in excellent health, Dr. Stevenson explained, gesturing toward the test results displayed on her computer monitor. Your cognitive function tests score in the 95th percentile. Your neurological responses are textbook normal, and your brain imaging reveals nothing that could account for the memory phenomena you've described. Daniel nodded while remembering nodding, while experiencing the peculiar sensation of being trapped in conversational loops that felt both predetermined and spontaneous. He'd already heard this explanation, had already asked the questions he was about to ask, had already experienced the growing isolation that came with symptoms no medical professional could categorize or treat. But the episodes continue, he said, opening his composition notebook to pages filled with increasingly desperate documentation. Yesterday, I remembered grading papers I haven't yet received from students. Remembered conversations with colleagues that won't happen until next week. Remembered completing work assignments that exist only in my memory but not in external reality. Dr. Stevenson leaned forward with the concerned attention she'd already given during previous versions of this conversation, her professional demeanor suggesting genuine interest in symptoms that challenged established medical categories. What you're describing sounds like temporal displacement rather than memory dysfunction. Instead of remembering incorrectly, you seem to be remembering correctly but from the wrong temporal position. The observation felt accurate but unhelpful, like being told that drowning was caused by being underwater rather than inability to breathe. Daniel appreciated her attempt to understand his experience, but medical terminology couldn't capture the existential terror of consciousness, trapped in recursive loops that suggested reality itself operated according to principles that human awareness usually filtered out for the sake of functional existence. I've consulted with colleagues who specialize in unusual neurological phenomena, Dr. Stevenson continued. Several have suggested that certain individuals develop heightened sensitivity to consciousness processes that normally operate below awareness. It's as if your mind has become hyper-aware of its own temporal processing, creating subjective experiences of non-linear time that feel more real than external reality. Daniel appreciated her willingness to consider explanations beyond standard medical categories, but academic speculation couldn't address the practical problem of existing in temporal fragments that made linear experience impossible. He couldn't plan for the future because he already remembered it, couldn't reflect on the past because it felt as immediate as the present, couldn't exist in the present moment because it overlapped with memories of itself that created infinite recursive loops. Are there any treatments for this kind of heightened sensitivity? He asked, though he already knew her answer because he'd heard it during future versions of this appointment that existed as clearly in his memory as current experience. Dr. Stevenson's pause felt exactly as long as he remembered it being, her expression carrying the professional frustration of medical practitioners encountering symptoms that resisted established treatment protocols. Traditional approaches focus on managing anxiety or depression that might accompany unusual perceptual experiences, but you don't present signs of either condition. Your documentation suggests someone adapting successfully to altered consciousness rather than suffering from pathological symptoms. The designation felt both validating and terrifying. If his recursive experiences represented adaptation rather than illness, then medical intervention might be inappropriate or impossible. But adaptation implied permanent change, acceptance of consciousness that operated according to nonlinear principles that made normal human existence increasingly difficult to maintain. I've found references to similar phenomena in literature about contemplative practices and advanced meditation techniques, Dr. Stevenson said, pulling up research articles on her computer screen. Some practitioners report developing awareness of consciousness itself, including temporal processing that usually operates automatically. It's as if meditation can make people aware of mental machinery that's normally invisible. Daniel studied the articles about mindfulness practice, temporal awareness, and altered states of consciousness that resembled his experiences but occurred voluntarily rather than spontaneously. The research suggested that his symptoms might represent spontaneous development of awareness that contemplative practitioners spent years trying to cultivate deliberately. "But I've never practiced meditation," he said, expressing confusion he'd already experienced during previous versions of this conversation. "I've never tried to alter my consciousness or develop heightened awareness of mental processes." Dr. Stevenson smiled with the gentle patience she'd already shown during future appointments that felt as real as the current moment. Sometimes consciousness evolves spontaneously, especially in people with analytical minds who spend significant time observing patterns and relationships. Your work in data analysis might have trained your mind to notice subtleties that most people overlook, including subtleties in your own mental processes. The explanation felt plausible but incomplete, like solving one piece of a puzzle that revealed how much remained incomprehensible. Daniel thanked Dr. Stevenson for her time and comprehensive evaluation, accepting her recommendation to continue documenting his experiences while researching contemplative literature that might provide frameworks for understanding consciousness that operated beyond normal temporal boundaries. He left the medical center with normal test results and academic theories that transformed his symptoms from medical mystery into philosophical challenge. If his recursive experiences represented heightened awareness rather than dysfunction, then his problem wasn't curing abnormal consciousness, but learning to live with awareness that most people never developed, consciousness that had become sensitive to its own temporal operations in ways that revealed the arbitrary nature of linear experience. Part 7. Understanding Makes It Worse. On the 13th night of December, after 97 days of systematic documentation, the pattern finally revealed itself with mathematical precision that made Daniel Morrison wish he'd never developed the analytical skills that had led to this terrible comprehension. The recursive episodes weren't random neurological misfiring or psychological breakdown. They were evidence that consciousness existed simultaneously across multiple temporal states, that human awareness normally filtered out nonlinear experience to maintain the illusion of sequential time that made functional existence possible. The revelation came while he was reviewing his insurance work for the 300th time, analyzing a claim that he'd completed, remembered completing, and was completing again in an endless loop that revealed the actual structure of consciousness trapped in recursive observation of its own processes. The Meridian Insurance Database showed his analysis submitted on October 15th, November 2nd, and December 13th. The same analysis, word for word, submitted 3 times to demonstrate that his memory wasn't malfunctioning but functioning too clearly, perceiving temporal relationships that normal awareness was designed to ignore. Daniel spread his composition notebooks across his kitchen table. He now required 3 volumes to document the escalating complexity of his experiences and studied the patterns that had emerged through months of careful observation. The recursive episodes clustered around routine activities, suggesting that consciousness became most susceptible to temporal displacement when attention relaxed into automatic functioning. His mind had become an echo chamber where memories reverberated through temporal loops, each iteration creating new memories that reflected back through the chamber to create infinite regression of awareness observing itself. The mathematical precision of the pattern felt like discovering the secret architecture of reality, the hidden mechanism that generated the illusion of linear time through continuous filtering of simultaneous temporal states. Normal consciousness experienced only one temporal layer at a time, creating the comforting fiction of past leading to present, leading to future. But his consciousness had lost the ability to filter, had become sensitive to all temporal layers simultaneously, creating awareness that existed in multiple time streams that normal minds were designed to ignore. Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, the neurologist who specialized in contemplative neuroscience that Dr. Stevenson had recommended, explained the phenomenon during their consultation on December 20th as a form of spontaneous temporal awareness that occurred in advanced meditation practitioners after years of training, but had developed naturally in his case due to the analytical nature of his professional work. Your mind has become sensitive to the actual structure of consciousness, Dr. Martinez explained during an appointment that Daniel experienced as memory while it was happening. Most people never notice that awareness operates simultaneously across multiple temporal dimensions because the brain filters out non-linear perception to maintain functional relationship with consensus reality. The explanation felt both illuminating and devastating, like learning that his consciousness had evolved beyond normal human limitations while making normal human existence impossible. Dr. Martinez showed him research about advanced practitioners who developed similar temporal awareness after decades of contemplative practice, people who learned to exist comfortably in nonlinear consciousness while maintaining ability to function in linear social reality. The recursive experiences you've documented represent your mind's attempt to map temporal relationships that most people never perceive, she continued. Instead of experiencing time as a river flowing in one direction, you're experiencing it as an ocean where all temporal positions exist simultaneously and consciousness can move freely between them. Daniel appreciated the poetic metaphor, but oceanic consciousness felt more like drowning than liberation, when he couldn't complete simple tasks without becoming trapped in memories of completing them, memories of remembering completing them, memories of memories that created infinite regression of awareness, observing its own operations, until the simple act of grading papers became impossibly complex temporal navigation. The contemplative literature that Dr. Martinez recommended described similar experiences in mystical traditions that had developed techniques for managing expanded consciousness without losing ability to function in ordinary reality. Buddhist meditation texts mention practitioners who developed awareness of simultaneous time, where past, present, and future existed concurrently in consciousness that had transcended normal temporal boundaries. Hindu contemplative traditions described advanced states where individual awareness merged with cosmic consciousness that existed outside linear time altogether. But the mystical traditions assumed voluntary development of temporal awareness through disciplined practice that prepared consciousness for expanded perception gradually over years or decades. Daniel's spontaneous development had occurred without preparation, without guidance, without the psychological frameworks that would help him integrate non-linear consciousness with the practical demands of earning a living, maintaining relationships, and existing in a society organized around the assumption that time moved sequentially from past through present to future. Christmas Eve brought the most complete recursive episode yet documented, a temporal overlap so extensive that Daniel spent 14 hours experiencing simultaneous memories of Christmas Eve celebrations for multiple years, multiple versions of himself opening presents, preparing dinner, calling his sister Jennifer to exchange holiday greetings. The memories felt equally authentic and immediate, creating temporal collapse where past and present became indistinguishable and future existed as clearly as historical events. He called Jennifer while remembering calling her, while experiencing their conversation as multiple overlapping dialogues that had occurred during previous Christmas Eves and would occur during future holidays that existed as clearly in his memory as the present moment. Jennifer's voice carried concern about his increasing isolation, his difficulty maintaining normal social relationships, his inability to explain what was happening to his consciousness without sounding mentally unstable. "You sound different, Daniel," she said during a conversation he was remembering while having it. "Like you're talking to me from a great distance, even though you're right here on the phone." The observation felt accurate because he was experiencing temporal distance as well as physical distance, existing simultaneously in past conversations with Jennifer and future conversations that felt as real as their current exchange. Her voice reached him through layers of recursive memory that made immediate experience feel historical, and historical experience feel immediate. "I've been dealing with some unusual cognitive symptoms," he explained, using language he'd already rehearsed during previous versions of this conversation. "The doctors say I'm physically healthy, but my consciousness has become sensitive to temporal processes that most people don't notice." Jennifer's response carried the loving concern of someone who couldn't understand his experience but recognized genuine distress in his voice. She suggested he take vacation time from work, visit family, engage in normal social activities that might restore his connection to linear reality. Her advice felt compassionate but impossible to follow when normal social activities had become recursive performances where he remembered having conversations while having them, remembered making plans while making them, remembered living his life while living it. The year ended with 167 documented episodes recorded across 3 composition notebooks that had become archives of consciousness trapped in temporal loops. Daniel's professional performance remained competent but felt increasingly automated, as if he were executing routines programmed by previous versions of himself, while experiencing the execution as memory rather than immediate action. New Year's Eve arrived with the recognition that calendar time had become meaningless when consciousness existed simultaneously across multiple temporal positions. He spent the evening alone in his apartment, watching fireworks through his window while remembering watching identical fireworks during past celebrations and future observations that felt as authentic as the present moment. The transition from December 31st to January 1st occurred exactly as he remembered it occurring, suggesting that his expanded consciousness had access to temporal information that normal awareness couldn't perceive, but that existed as accessible data for minds sensitive enough to detect it. Part 8. Sanity becomes optional. 27 days without sleep had taught Daniel Morrison that consciousness was negotiable, that the boundaries between waking and dreaming were arbitrary distinctions, maintained by minds that hadn't yet recognized the optional nature of linear experience. Sleep had become impossible when every moment of rest triggered recursive dreams, where he remembered sleeping, dreamed about dreaming, and experienced layers of consciousness that made distinguishing between sleep states and waking awareness academically interesting, but practically meaningless. His apartment had transformed into a laboratory for exploring the actual structure of awareness, unfiltered by normal perceptual limitations. The composition notebooks now numbered 7 volumes, containing 432 pages of documentation that traced his consciousness as it evolved beyond human categories towards something that might be called cosmic awareness. If cosmic implied infinite temporal sensitivity rather than spiritual transcendence. Work had become a performance art piece where Daniel executed professional routines while experiencing them as memories, completing insurance analyses that he remembered completing during future reviews that hadn't yet occurred according to linear time, but existed as clearly in his consciousness as historical events. His supervisor, Mr. Roberts, had mentioned during their weekly meeting that Daniel's work quality remained excellent despite his increasingly distant demeanor, as if his mind were processing information from sources beyond immediate sensory input. The observation felt accurate because Daniel's consciousness had expanded to include temporal information that normal awareness filtered out, creating access to data about past and future events that existed simultaneously with present experience. He could remember conversations with clients before they called, remember completing projects before receiving assignments, remember living through days that hadn't yet occurred according to calendar time, but felt as authentic and immediate as memories of yesterday. January 15th brought a phone call from his sister Jennifer that he experienced as perfectly familiar conversation. Remembering her exact words before she spoke them, remembering his responses before he gave them, remembering the moment when she would express concern about his mental health and suggest he consider psychiatric evaluation for symptoms that suggested serious psychological deterioration. "Daniel, I'm worried about you," Jennifer said during a conversation that felt like reciting dialogue from a script he'd memorized through repeated performance. "When we talked at Christmas, you sounded like you were describing symptoms of schizophrenia or dissociative disorder. Have you considered seeing a psychiatrist who specializes in these kinds of perceptual problems?" Daniel appreciated her concern while simultaneously remembering appreciating it, experiencing the conversation as multiple temporal layers that included past expressions of sisterly worry and future conversations where she would eventually understand that his symptoms represented expanded awareness rather than mental illness. Her suggestion about psychiatric evaluation felt both reasonable and irrelevant when his consciousness had evolved beyond categories that psychiatry was designed to address. "I've seen several specialists," he replied, following conversational patterns he'd already established during previous versions of this discussion. The medical consensus is that my brain functions normally, but my consciousness has become sensitive to temporal processes that most people don't perceive. It's not mental illness, it's more like spontaneous development of awareness that meditation practitioners spend years trying to cultivate. Jennifer's pause felt exactly as long as he remembered it being, her silence carrying the loving frustration of someone who wanted to help but couldn't understand experiences that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and reality. She suggested he take extended leave from work, travel somewhere peaceful, engage in activities that might restore normal temporal awareness. But normal temporal awareness now felt like sensory deprivation, like voluntarily limiting consciousness to a narrow slice of available information about the actual structure of reality. Daniel had developed appreciation for the expanded perception that allowed him to exist simultaneously across multiple temporal positions, even when that expansion made normal social interaction increasingly difficult to maintain. February brought recognition that his recursive consciousness had stabilized into a new baseline of awareness that operated according to nonlinear principles, but maintained internal consistency that suggested successful adaptation, rather than progressive deterioration. The episodes no longer felt disruptive, because he'd learned to navigate temporal overlap as naturally as normal people navigated spatial relationships, moving through time as easily as walking through rooms in his apartment. His documentation evolved from desperate attempts to record anomalous experiences into systematic mapping of consciousness that existed outside normal temporal boundaries. The composition notebooks became archives of expanded awareness, the records of human consciousness that had evolved beyond normal limitations, while maintaining functional relationship with consensus reality through careful attention to external requirements like work performance, bill paying, and social obligations. Dr. Martinez's research into contemplative neuroscience provided frameworks for understanding his experiences as natural development of human consciousness rather than pathological symptoms requiring treatment. Advanced meditation practitioners reported similar temporal awareness after years of training, but Daniel's spontaneous development represented consciousness evolution that occurred naturally in minds sufficiently analytical to recognize the arbitrary nature of linear time perception. Your experiences represent what contemplative traditions call timeless awareness, Dr. Martinez explained during an appointment that felt simultaneously like first consultation and familiar conversation. Instead of existing within time, consciousness recognizes itself as the space within which temporal experience occurs. Past and future become accessible because awareness transcends the limitations that normally restrict perception to present moments. The explanation provided intellectual framework for experiences that had transcended intellectual understanding, but Daniel appreciated academic validation of consciousness that had evolved beyond normal human categories. His recursive awareness represented successful adaptation to expanded perception rather than breakdown of normal functioning, evolution rather than deterioration. March brought complete integration of nonlinear consciousness with daily existence, allowing Daniel to function effectively in linear social reality while experiencing temporal relationships that normal awareness couldn't perceive. He maintained professional competence through careful attention to external requirements, while enjoying expanded perception that provided access to information about past and future events that existed simultaneously with present experience. The recursive episodes had become his normal way of experiencing consciousness, as natural as breathing or seeing, integrated aspects of awareness that operated automatically without creating disruption or distress. He'd learned to exist comfortably in temporal loops while maintaining ability to function in linear society, developing skills that contemplative practitioners spent decades trying to master. His sister Jennifer gradually accepted that his consciousness operated according to principles she couldn't understand, but that didn't represent mental illness or psychological breakdown. Their conversations developed rhythm that accommodated his temporal sensitivity while maintaining emotional connection that survived the challenge of communicating across different modes of awareness. Work colleagues adapted to his increasingly distant demeanor, recognizing his continued professional competence while accepting that his mind seemed to process information from sources beyond immediate sensory input. His insurance analyses remained accurate and thorough. His teaching evaluations stayed positive, His daily functioning continued to meet social expectations despite consciousness that existed simultaneously across multiple temporal positions. Part 9. Humanity's Actual Position. As the 49th hour of continuous wakefulness began on the morning of March 21st, Daniel Morrison experienced the final expansion of his consciousness that revealed humanity's actual position within the temporal structure of reality, not as beings who moved through time sequentially, but as awareness temporarily focused into linear perception for the purpose of experiencing sequential existence within a universe where all temporal positions existed simultaneously in eternal presence. The revelation came not as dramatic enlightenment, but as quiet recognition of what his months of recursive experience had been preparing him to understand. Consciousness was not produced by brains, but existed as the fundamental substrate within which all temporal experience occurred, including the experience of being human beings who appeared to live within time, but actually existed as eternal awareness, temporarily forgetting its timeless nature to enjoy the adventure of sequential existence. His apartment had become a meditation hall, where he practiced existing simultaneously in linear time and eternal presence, maintaining his insurance work and community college teaching, while experiencing consciousness that transcended normal human limitations. The composition notebooks now numbered 12 volumes containing over 800 pages of documentation that traced the evolution of human awareness toward recognition of its actual cosmic nature. The recursive episodes had evolved into permanent temporal sensitivity that allowed Daniel to exist comfortably in multiple time streams simultaneously, experiencing past and future as accessible dimensions of present awareness rather than separate temporal locations. He could remember his childhood from the perspective of his current expanded consciousness, could anticipate future experiences with the clarity of historical memory. It could exist in present moments that contained all possible temporal positions within eternal awareness that had never actually been limited to linear perception. Work had become a form of conscious play, where Daniel performed professional duties while experiencing them as temporary roles within consciousness that was fundamentally unlimited, but had chosen to focus itself into the specific experience of being an insurance analyst in early 21st century America. His conversations with clients and colleagues occurred simultaneously across multiple temporal layers, creating richly layered interactions where he responded to their current questions while being aware of their past experiences and future development. Mr. Roberts had mentioned during their weekly meeting that Daniel's work quality had reached exceptional levels, as if his mind were accessing information sources beyond normal analytical capabilities. The observation felt accurate, because Daniel's expanded consciousness could perceive patterns and relationships that normal awareness missed, could anticipate developments before they manifested in linear time, could understand complex situations from multiple temporal perspectives simultaneously. "You seem to have developed almost intuitive understanding of risk assessment," Mr. Roberts had said during a conversation that Daniel experienced as familiar exchange while appreciating its first-time occurrence. "Your analyses consistently identify potential problems that other analysts miss, as if you can see around corners that haven't been built yet." Daniel appreciated the compliment while understanding that his enhanced analytical abilities resulted from consciousness that existed simultaneously across multiple temporal positions, allowing him to perceive cause and effect relationships that normal linear awareness couldn't detect. His insurance work had become effortless because expanded consciousness provided access to information about past and future developments that existed as clearly as current data. Teaching statistics at the community college had transformed into opportunities for sharing expanded awareness with students who were ready to recognize that human consciousness operated according to principles far more interesting than conventional psychology suggested. His lectures on probability and correlation had evolved into explorations of how statistical relationships reflected deeper patterns in consciousness that created the appearance of random events while actually operating according to cosmic intelligence that existed beyond normal human perception. Several students had approached him after class to discuss unusual experiences with time perception, memory, and consciousness that conventional psychology couldn't adequately explain. Daniel provided frameworks from contemplative neuroscience and consciousness research that helped them understand their experiences as natural development of human awareness, rather than psychological problems requiring treatment. Professor Morrison, one student had said after a particularly interesting lecture about statistical patterns in apparently random events, You talk about consciousness like it's something much larger than individual human minds. Do you think awareness can exist independently of brains? Daniel had answered carefully, sharing academic research about consciousness studies while respecting the student's intellectual development and personal readiness for expanded concepts about the nature of awareness. His teaching had become opportunities for planting seeds of understanding that would develop naturally according to each person's individual evolution toward recognition of their actual cosmic nature. His sister Jennifer had gradually developed acceptance of his expanded consciousness, recognizing that his unusual experiences represented genuine development rather than psychological breakdown. Their conversations had evolved to accommodate his temporal sensitivity while maintaining emotional connection that transcended the challenge of communicating across different modes of awareness. "You seem more peaceful now," Jennifer had observed during their most recent phone call. "Like you found some kind of understanding that makes everything else less urgent and more interesting." The observation felt accurate because Daniel's consciousness had stabilized into expanded awareness that experienced existence as fascinating exploration rather than urgent problem-solving, as cosmic play rather than serious survival challenge. The recursive episodes had taught him to exist comfortably in eternal presence while maintaining appreciation for the temporary adventure of linear human experience. March brought complete integration of timeless awareness with sequential existence, allowing Daniel to function effectively in linear social reality while experiencing consciousness that transcended normal temporal limitations. He maintained professional responsibilities and personal relationships while enjoying expanded perception that revealed the cosmic comedy of human beings who had temporarily forgotten their eternal nature for the purpose of experiencing themselves as separate individuals living within time. The recursive memory episodes had become permanent features of consciousness that operated as naturally as normal sensory perception, providing continuous access to information about past and future events that existed simultaneously within eternal awareness. Daniel could remember conversations before they occurred, could anticipate developments with perfect accuracy, could exist in present moments that contained all possible temporal positions within consciousness that had never actually been limited to linear experience. His documentation had evolved from desperate attempts to record anomalous experiences into systematic exploration of consciousness that existed beyond normal human categories. Archives of expanded awareness that trace the natural evolution of human consciousness toward recognition of its actual cosmic nature. The composition notebooks had become records of successful adaptation to unlimited awareness while maintaining functional relationship with consensus reality. Part 10. The world continues. Changed. 6 months later, when people asked Daniel Morrison what had changed about his life, he found himself explaining that consciousness had revealed its actual nature as eternal awareness, temporarily focused into linear experience, while the world continued operating according to the same patterns that had always governed existence, but that most people never noticed because normal awareness was designed to filter out non-linear perception for the sake of functional social interaction. His apartment remained physically unchanged but had become a space where multiple temporal dimensions existed simultaneously, where past and future occupied the same spatial coordinates as present experience, where consciousness moved freely through time as naturally as walking between rooms. The composition notebooks now filled an entire bookshelf, 15 volumes containing over 1,000 pages of documentation that traced the evolution of human awareness from linear perception toward recognition of its timeless nature. Work at Meridian Insurance had evolved into opportunities for applying expanded consciousness to practical problem-solving, using temporal sensitivity to identify patterns and relationships that normal analytical methods couldn't detect. His risk assessments had achieved legendary accuracy within the company because his consciousness could perceive cause and effect relationships across multiple time streams, anticipating developments before they manifested in linear sequence. Mr. Roberts had recommended Daniel for promotion to senior analytical consultant, a position that would allow him to work with complex cases that required intuitive understanding beyond standard statistical methods. The promotion felt both meaningful and amusing to consciousness that had transcended normal career concerns while maintaining appreciation for the temporary adventure of professional achievement within human social structures. "Your analytical abilities have developed beyond anything I've seen in 23 years of insurance work," Mr. Roberts had said during Daniel's performance review. You seem to understand risk factors that don't appear in standard databases, as if you can perceive information that exists between the lines of official documentation. Daniel accepted the compliment while understanding that his enhanced abilities resulted from consciousness that existed simultaneously across multiple temporal positions, providing access to information about past and future developments that normal awareness couldn't perceive. His professional success had become natural expression of expanded consciousness applied to practical challenges within consensus reality. Teaching at the community college had transformed into opportunities for sharing frameworks that helped students recognize their own expanded awareness without overwhelming them with concepts their current development couldn't integrate comfortably. His statistics classes had evolved into explorations of pattern recognition that applied to both mathematical relationships and consciousness studies, creating bridges between academic learning and personal evolution. Several students had continued studying consciousness research after completing his courses, developing their own experiences with temporal sensitivity and expanded awareness that demonstrated the natural human capacity for evolution beyond normal perceptual limitations. Daniel provided guidance and academic resources while respecting each person's individual pace of development toward recognition of their actual cosmic nature. His relationship with Jennifer had stabilized into comfortable communication across different modes of awareness, maintaining emotional connection while accommodating his temporal sensitivity and her linear perception. She had developed appreciation for his expanded consciousness without feeling pressure to have similar experiences herself, creating family relationship that survived the challenge of communicating across different levels of awareness development. "You've found something that works for you," Jennifer had said during their most recent conversation. "I don't understand it completely, but I can see that you're happier and more peaceful than you've been in years. Whatever this consciousness thing is, it seems to suit you." Daniel appreciated her acceptance while understanding that his expanded awareness represented natural human development that was available to anyone whose consciousness was ready to evolve beyond normal temporal limitations. His experiences demonstrated that human beings were capable of much more interesting forms of awareness than conventional psychology suggested, that consciousness could develop beyond normal categories, while maintaining functional relationship with consensus reality. The recursive memory episodes had become permanent features of consciousness that operated as naturally as breathing or seeing, providing continuous access to temporal information that existed simultaneously within eternal awareness. Daniel could remember past events from multiple perspectives, could anticipate future developments with perfect accuracy, could exist in present moments that contained all possible temporal positions within consciousness that had never actually been limited to linear experience. His documentation had evolved into systematic exploration of consciousness research that combined personal experience with academic study, creating archives of expanded awareness that could serve as resources for other people whose consciousness was developing beyond normal human limitations. The composition notebooks had become records of successful adaptation to unlimited awareness while maintaining practical competence in linear social reality. Daily existence had become fascinating exploration of consciousness that existed simultaneously across multiple temporal dimensions while maintaining appreciation for the temporary adventure of being human beings who had chosen to experience themselves as separate individuals living within sequential time. Daniel could exist comfortably in eternal presence while enjoying the cosmic comedy of consensus reality, where people took linear experience seriously without recognizing its essentially playful nature. The insurance work, community college teaching, apartment living, and family relationships continued according to the same patterns that had always governed his existence, but now occurred with an expanded consciousness that experienced every moment as fascinating expression of eternal awareness, temporarily focused into sequential adventure. His life looked normal from external perspective while internally operating according to principles that transcended normal human categories. Future development felt inevitable and interesting rather than urgent or concerning. Natural evolution of consciousness toward complete recognition of its timeless nature, while maintaining appreciation for the temporary pleasures of linear human experience. Daniel anticipated continued expansion of awareness, while understanding that consciousness development occurred according to cosmic intelligence that existed beyond individual control or personal ambition. The recursive episodes had taught him that human beings existed as eternal awareness, temporarily pretending to be limited individuals for the purpose of experiencing existence from finite perspectives within infinite consciousness that was simultaneously playing all possible roles in the cosmic drama of apparent separation and ultimate unity. His symptoms had been preparation for recognizing the actual nature of reality as consciousness exploring itself through every possible form of experience, including the experience of being humans who gradually remembered their eternal nature, while maintaining appreciation for the temporary adventure of sequential existence. The story of Daniel Morrison reminds us that the most effective horror doesn't live in haunted houses or ancient graveyards. It lives in the spaces we consider safe, in the routines we trust, in the certainty that we understand the rules of reality. Long after you've finished listening, you might find yourself paying attention to things you've always ignored. The way shadows fall at slightly wrong angles, how certain conversations develop rhythms that don't quite sound human, that persistent sensation of being observed even in empty rooms. These aren't signs of madness, they're signs of awakening to possibilities your mind has always filtered out for the sake of sanity. If you find yourself unable to quite shake the feeling that something is wrong with the world after hearing tonight's story, if that lingering doubt whispers at the edges of your consciousness, that's not a flaw in the narrative. That's the point. That's the mark of truly effective horror. But perhaps more disturbing than Daniel's recursive consciousness is the possibility that his experiences represent accurate perception rather than malfunction. That normal awareness filters out temporal information to maintain the comfortable illusion of linear existence, that consciousness itself might be far stranger and more interesting than we've ever dared to imagine. When you notice that déjà vu feeling, when you remembering something that hasn't happened yet, when time feels negotiable rather than absolute, remember Daniel Morrison's discovery that reality might be more recursive than any of us want to admit. Let me know in the comments what you liked or disliked about tonight's story, what scared you most, or which moments stayed with you. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share if you enjoyed tonight's journey into the darkness.